If you're from Baltimore, you know a thing or two about Pratt Street. And if you're not from around these parts, well, you've come to the right place. Today, we're going to be talking about Pratt Street. It runs east to west in Baltimore City along the Inner Harbor. And more importantly, what role did the B&O play in that? We're talking about the C-16 tank engines that plied the rails of Pratt Street and served the vital commerces and industries along that street. Hi, this is Trevor from History on the Move. Sit back, relax, grab your favorite cup of coffee, tea, whatever it is that you drink, and enjoy this episode. I think you're going to really like this. We're going to get you outside of the museum and see Pratt Street for what it is. So at the outset of this video, we mentioned the C-16 tank engine and what role did it play serving the Mount Clare shops as well as the Pratt Street Waterfront? Well, to understand that, we have to go into the Wayback Machine and pick out a few key dates to get to this point of needing the C-16. So let's start off with February of 1827. The B&O signs its charter. July 4th, 1828, the B&O then lays its first stone in Mount Clare, Baltimore, and begins the push out west of building rail to get to the Ohio River Valley. 1831, Pratt Street idea is kicked around in the B&O. So the B&O then writes to the Baltimore City people and they say, hey, we want to build along the waterfront because we'd like to be able to serve those industries. Do we have your permission? The city writes back and says, yeah, sure, you can do that. But there's a few key things. There's two main things you need to do. You have two restrictions in place. One, you cannot use these primitive steam engines along that line. You have to use horses because the steam engines were primitive and they were prone to kind of scaring and alarming animals and some people as well. And two, you have to do this at night because Pratt Street is kind of a main thoroughfare. There's lots of horse and buggies and carts and people going up and down Pratt Street. You got to do this stuff at night when people are asleep. So B&O writes back, says, sure, got it. So the B&O then begins to build track all along Pratt Street to the cobblestone up to in 1832. They begin to build out and further east towards points like Locust Point, et cetera, et cetera. And so now they have kind of a small little industry going east of the Mount Clare shops. And the first time that we see a steam engine is 1835. Baltimore City then writes back and says, all right, we give. You can operate your steam engines, but you have to still do it at night. You got to do it when people are asleep. So they say, okay, got it. So the B&O then used these grasshopper engines that you can actually still see, one of them, several of them, at the inside of the museum itself. But they use these grasshopper engines to switch out the industries. And they use these for a pretty good amount of time. It's not until 1890 that the B&O then built their own 040 tank engine, number 31. And what's neat about this thing is it has this big giant, it looked like a streetcar, right? The whole thing was covered over it. And you say, well, why is that? Well, because streetcars were less prone to scaring the animals. You got this big thing that's chuffing and making noise and the air compressor cycling and all that good stuff. You're going to scare the animals. And so they didn't want that. So they decided, well, if we cover it over, you're not going to, it's less likely to scare the horses. So the B&O used number 31 all the way up into 1912. And 1912, B&O says, you know what? This thing is starting to become, kind of a cantankerous coal burning thing. Let's do you one better. And so this is where we get the C-16. And I should rewind for a second and say that that same one, number 31, also switched out the Mount Clare shops because the cars that came from along the Pratt Street waterfront were then put into B Yard in Mount Clare and then sent out. They were shuffled around and organized, and then they were sent out west to wherever it is that they were going, and vice versa. When the cars were to come from out beyond Mount Clare, when they were inbound to industries along Pratt Street, they would then be shuffled around in B Yard and then taken out to the through that Pratt Street opening, if you will, east of the roundhouse, and then taken out at night. This whole thing was done at night. And again, That's the, it was kind of set already in motion by the city, and that was that. And it was also easier to traverse the streets, steam engine or not, when there's nobody there. So the C-16 comes along in December of 1912, and this is pretty startling stuff for them because, one, these little tank engines have oil burning units. They're not coal anymore. And so they're oil burning. They have a wagonette power reverse in them, which, in lieu of a Johnson bar. And they are pretty state-of-the-art, if you will, for their time frame. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. But why don't we go inside and let's talk a little bit more about why these things were so special. So in 1912, the B&O writes to the Baldwin Locomotive Works and says, hey, we are looking to buy 4 tank engines to work our Mount Clare shops and the Pratt Street waterfront area. And the Pratt Street waterfront area has these really tight curves, and we have to work at night and smoke abatement and blah, blah, blah. So Baldwin comes back and says, all right, we'll build you 4 of our finest. And so these parameters are in place to where you get things like a wagonette power reverse. Now, in 1912, that's pretty state-of-the-art because power reverse is just starting to come into fashion. And so these tank engines have power reverse on them. And that is, so that way the engineer's not fighting the Johnson bar and having to constantly, fight his own self just to adjust his cutoff. And so they also come with things like an oil burning firebox to make it the life easier of the firemen and also for the smoke abatement in Baltimore City. And a 7-foot wheelbase in order to negotiate these tight curves. And as I was reading, some of these C-16s at speed could go up to, could negotiate a 50-degree curve. And if they took it really slow, like along the Pratt Street waterfront, they could do almost an 85 or an 80-degree curve. That's insane to think about. But a 7-foot wheelbase gets you there. So, 1912, these 4 engines come out and they're working, Mount Clare and the Pratt Street waterfront. And 1926, the numbers 96 and 99 end up being converted to coal, and they have a tender put on them. And the cab is reconfigured, and then they get 96 and 99 get sent up to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to work that waterfront area because the B&O had a presence there as well. And so these locomotives are, when you see them in photos, they're very iconic. And I think that is just, it's sad that we don't have any in preservation, but they're really fascinating little locomotives. And they worked a good long time. Heck, 97 and 98 working Mount Clare and the Pratt Street waterfront weren't retired until 1951, and later they were scrapped in the same year. And the same holds true, I think 96 and 99 were scrapped a little bit earlier than that because the Philadelphia waterfront area kind of quieted up, if you will, quieted down long before the Pratt Street waterfront commerce area did. So pretty amazing stuff. And the fact that these things are so iconic that people can just look at them and recognize them. And there's a nice little soft spot in all of us for these little tank engines. So if you've been a fan of this channel for any length of time, or perhaps you're new here, thanks for finding us. As a history major, I was always taught to cite your sources. Used to have a history professor named Dr. Robert Rook, and he would say, Trevor, that's great, but cite your sources, all right? Well, for this episode, here we go. So to understand the Pratt Street operations and the C-16 tank engine itself, I used this guy here, A Picture History of B&O Motive Power by Larry Sagel, or if you're a formal person, that's Lawrence W. Sagel. And Larry Sagel was, he's dead now, was a PR guy for the B&O years ago. And when the B&O Transportation Museum opened up in 1953, he moved into there as well. So he was Mr. B&O, if you will. Guy knew a lot of stuff. And this really goes into some good details about the C-16, as well as other motive power of the B&O. And B&O in Baltimore, 160 years of history in the Charm City area by the B&O Historical Society was a, cannot say enough good things. So B&O Historical Society, if you are watching this, big 2 thumbs up. This was a great read. I found this one to be absolutely phenomenal. They go into some really good details. Whoever wrote the section about Pratt Street operations, chef's kiss. They did a great job. They get into all the little details, and you get a good understanding as to how that operated. And if you want to learn more about the C-16 as it came from Baldwin, I highly recommend the Baldwin Locomotive Works Industrial and Contractor Service. The copyright on this is 1914, but I believe I got this one off of Amazon. You can buy your books wherever you buy them. I'm not here to promote anything, as long as you buy them. Don't steal them. And if you borrow them from the library, return them. This is a really good read in terms of understanding the specs as it came from Baldwin. So if you can find this, definitely worth it. And one that I will definitely say was super helpful was the July 1941 edition of the Baltimore, Ohio magazine. This is the employee magazine that the B&O put out for, well, its employees. And in this particular one, Larry Sagel, yep, that guy, wrote an article called Pratt Street Nocturne Baltimore. And he talks about number 97 and 98 and the Pratt Street operations, and just really good detail and some really good photos too. So wherever you can find this, if this is your thing, the Pratt Street operations or C-16 tank engines, I highly recommend you go looking for it. So get out there and remember, always read your sources and read them carefully. So as you can see, the C-16 tank engine really served the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad well. Whether it was working in the Mount Clare yards or going up and down the Pratt Street waterfront at midnight, it really did its job, and it did it well. And it was beloved by the crews that ran it. And sadly, as I mentioned before, all 4 of these things were scrapped. So none of them survived past 1951 into preservation, but the closest you can get to one of these is the little HO scale model like this. This one happened to be built by Rivarossi. Now, I purchased this one many, many years ago. But this one has the Walschaerts valve gear and lots of other really neat little nuances that are pretty accurate and pretty close to the builder's photo and the blueprints as well. So this is neat in the fact that it survives and it lives on in model form. It's about as good as we're going to get. So if you see one of these at a railroad show or online or whatever, feel free to pick one up. I think they're neat. They run way faster than their actual prototypes, but they're still fun to see go around, and you can say, you know what, I've got my own C-16. All right, so we are in the front of the Mount Clare shop, and if you come in here, you'll see, 1, all the cobblestones, but 2, you'll see this track that this freight train has been put on. And this is one of the tracks that leads down to Pratt Street. So if we keep walking here, we'll get closer to the end of this string. And what you see in terms of these cobblestones, this is what Pratt Street would have been before they paved it over. This is what they had to walk on. So again, this right here, this track is what led out onto Pratt Street. And if we keep going here, we'll get to the end and we'll see that right here we get a good view of where it doesn't really go there anymore. But yes, so Pratt Street is here. Pratt Street runs east and west. So this would have came out and gone right there. The Mount Clare overlook was not there at the time, but this would have gone out and then curved around. So why don't we get out on the street and let's see what we can see from there. All right, so for orientation purposes, before we go out on the street, this is the track that we're going to be essentially following, but this is heading west. There's the passenger car shop, better known as the Roundhouse. And back when the C-16s were doing their jobs, they would be going up this track through Mount Clare itself, the shop complex, and then all the way on the other side of the Monroe Street Bridge would have been sitting B yard. So just west of Monroe Street Bridge is the B yard. And that's where they would have dumped the cars off. They would have been put in the correct order and then taken out to wherever they were heading out west. So let's get out on the Pratt Street now and keep walking. All right, so as we walk through, now Pratt Street is over here. As we walk along Pratt Street here, let's talk a little history, right? Channel is called History on the Move. And let's start off with the harbor itself was not the biggest source of commerce for Baltimore, the city. And the main reason that the inner harbor was not is because it's very shallow. Fells Point, Canton, and Locust Point were really the deep water ports, if you will. and those were the ones that got most of the big heavy ships coming in and out. And so, you know, the inner harbor really did not come to its own until really the beginning of the 1800s. And so, you know, Pratt Street, as you see here, begins to become built up. You begin to see more businesses, and the brick buildings like what you see over here behind me become to be built up. And this is where, again, to go back to the timeline, 1832 is when the B&O builds the track heading out here along Pratt Street. And, you know, the inner harbor itself is kind of an interesting thing, in the fact that, you know, the majority of the goods that were coming in and out was seafood and stuff that was local, right? So that's our turn to walk. So the majority of the stuff that was coming in and out of the harbor were, again, seafood and things like fruit and other stuff like that, things that were local up and down the eastern seaboard. And so that stuff would just get taken into the inner harbor and put there. And eventually that would be transferred to rail, hence why the B&O was trying to get into the port, and then be taken out west for greater good and to, you know, to be sold out there as well. And, you know, obviously, and they kept a lot of that local as well. So, yeah, but the port itself is, the inner harbor itself is just a phenomenal thing if you come to Baltimore to check out. So let's keep walking here, and I'll pick you up in a few seconds. All right, so I'm further up here, east. So this is Green Street, as you can see from the sign above me. Green Street's interesting in the main reason in that right up here, there would have been a runaround switch. And so it's right up here, there would have been the switch that comes out and it splits, and you have a runaround track up here. And that track is what allowed the C-16 engines to come up here and shuffle the cars, get them at least onto here, and then continue east to keep picking up more cars. So that is pretty interesting, and you can see from the road itself, they have paved over the cobblestone. That is what they did in Baltimore. They just paved right over it. And so you can see that going all the way up. So as we head east here, here's a really good example you can see. I want to make sure I'm not totally in this, but here's the original cobblestone right here. Obviously you can see where they've paved over it multiple times, but that is where, this is the original we call roadbed, and this is what the tracks would have been on. And so Paca Street is here, and if we keep heading east, we'll get to Utah, and that is where that runaround track ends, and then it goes back into a single track and keeps heading east there, and then we're pretty much at the harbor. All right, so I told you a big fat lie. That's the Bromo Seltzer Tower, by the way, for all of you non-Baltimoreans watching. So that switch, that runaround, actually ends up at Howard Street up here. So I told you a big fat lie, but I want to correct that in real time. And as we walk, we are coming up on the harbor right here. And we're going to go try to find that building, that the famous, I think it's famous photo of the C-16 pulling a car out from the Hearst building. So let's keep walking to see if we can find that. Okay, so I've moved up to Light Street here, and this essentially marks the beginning of the harbor. So the harbor is right here, and this was a site of big revitalization in the 70s and 80s, mostly the 80s and 90s, actually, now I think it's the 80s and 90s. There was a, after World War II, the harbor really began to fall into decline. There wasn't as much, as I mentioned, like fruits, vegetables, fresh stuff coming from the East Coast, as well as the seafood that was coming in. It was kind of starting to get quiet around the harbor. And so what ended up happening was they took the city kind of, fell into decline, and I think the B&O itself started to slow down on the amount of service, in terms of switching out cars along Pratt Street here, that it did. So they eventually resorted in the 80s and 90s into turning this from a commercial area of vast industrialization to what you see now, which is more, this is Harbor Place, and this is where you would see There's a lot of shops and retail and stuff like that, and there was Baltimore City's way of trying to revitalize that. There's a really good video by Johns Hopkins is his name, and he is part of the Hopkins brethren. He is part of the family, and it's from it's Explore Baltimore, or Baltimore Explorer. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's also like 20 degrees outside right now, and I'm freezing my huevos off. So, but I will link that down there so you can watch that video. He does a great job of explaining the history of this. So let's keep going. We're almost on Commerce Street, and that is where that famous photo was taken of the C-16 switcher pulling out that boxcar from Hearst newspaper. Well, it's like they knew I was coming. So this cone, not put there by me, essentially marks the spot where between South Street and Commerce Street where the Hearst newspaper building would have been. Now it's, well, it's a parking lot. So sadly, yeah, I led you on. I knew it wasn't there. But that building is now, well, in a landfill somewhere. But this is neat, though, that we at least can kind of get you into the world of what those C-16 switchers did. And so looking this way, this is looking west. And so the tracks would have come all the way down here, and you know the Mount Clare shops are all the way back west there. So this is about as far as we're going to go. It continues the whole run from Pratt Street, from Mount Clare all the way to the end where President Street is down there, is 22 blocks. We're not going to walk the whole thing, but it would have teed off and gone down here, and there was a team track at the end of there, and all kinds of good other stuff. And if you really want to explore that more, I highly recommend that you pick up that book, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Historical Society, about the B&O in Charm City. That is a phenomenal read and has the maps to show you. And I'll plug those along, you know, hopefully as we finish this walk here. But you know, let's get back inside. Let's get inside the shop where it's warm. We'll talk a little bit more about these tank engines. Well, we're back at the shop now. I really hope you got a good understanding of what Pratt Street looked like then versus now. And it's fun to point out that, yeah, sadly in that iconic photo of the C-16, that building's not there anymore. But you still have a rough idea as to what you would see out along Pratt Street. And more importantly, how important that waterfront was to the B&O in terms of revenue and bringing cars in and out and really keeping the Baltimore City commerce going. So this is Trevor from History on the Move. Stay tuned. We got some really good videos coming your way. I say that in every video, but 99.2% of the time, it's true. So stay tuned and make sure you get out there and read history, explore history, but most importantly, make your own history. I'll see you on the next one.